So, very good morning to all the participants of this webinar. And it's my proud privilege to welcome our very respected speaker, Dr. Heminder Bharti ji, Head of Department Zoology and Environmental Sciences, Punjabi University, Patiala. Sir, I through this platform welcome you on behalf of PG Department of Zoology as well as D.A.V College, Jalandhar.
Thank you.
Sir, our college is a 103-year-old premier institute of North India having PG courses in 18 disciplines. And the post-graduation course in zoology started up in 2003. And we are a DBT, Government of India sponsored department as well as DST FIST sponsored department of the college. And our college is making progress even in this odd time under the able leadership of Dr. S.K. Arora ji, principal, who is a visionary in the field of academics and research. I welcome all the staff members from D.A.V College as well as from the other departments and other institutions. I also welcome all the participants from the region. And now I would like to switch over to Dr. Abhinay Thakur, who is the organizing secretary, and he will be introducing our today's speaker formally. Over to Abhinay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Very good morning, all. I, Abhinay Thakur, organizing secretary of today's event, welcome you all on the behalf of PG Department of Zoology. First of all, I would like to warm welcome of our respected principal sir, who will join us later, and respected HOD sir and other staff members who always support and encourage to organize such event in the department. And I also welcome all the participants in this event. And now I will welcome our resource person of the day, Dr. Heminder Bharti. Sir, welcome. I welcome you all on this podium.
Thank
And
you.
okay, sir. Today we will have an opportunity to listen to your valuable information. So before starting this session, I would like to briefly introduce her. So Dr. Heminder Bharti is currently head of the Department of Zoology and Environmental Sciences, Punjab University, Patiala. And he is an evolutionary biologist with keen interest in insect systematics, phylogeography, species pattern, phylogenetics, ecology, and conservation biology. He is widely traveled and has delivered invited talks and lectures at many international fora. And he has distinction in visiting Nature History Museum, London, and other natural history museum in Southeast Asia. Dr. Bharti has been nominated as Fellow of prestigious Royal Entomological Society, London, and has also been conferred with Distinguished Taxonomist Award by T.C. Narendran Trust for Animal Taxonomy. So he has also visited Himalayan regions, Western Ghat, and tropical forests of Southeast Asia, and exploring the intricacies of wonderful world of ants. He is credited with the discovery of more than 100 new species of ants, and in addition to a number of new records. His findings include endemic and red list species, and Dr. Bharti has published more than 100 such papers till date, and his ventures have throughout been sponsored by various national funding agencies like DBT, DST, Ministry of Environmental and Forest, and ICR, etc. He has already completed 10 major research projects funded by various agencies, and presently he is working on 2 major research projects sponsored by DST and MOEF, respectively. As a resource for the country, he has guided 8 MPhil and 15 PhD students. As an internationally accomplished scientist, Dr. Bharti is involved in Discover Life Project, Harvard University, Global Ant Project, Formicidae, Barcode of Life, Global Project on Ant Genomics, Encyclopedia of Life, AntWiki, and Web Project, that is California Academy of Science, for red listing of Asian ants. Dr. Bharti is also involved with UCN, that is International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. At present, He happens to be president of International Network for Study of Ants and IUSSI, that is International Union for Study of Social Insects. Indian chapters. He is on the editorial board of various international journals and chief editor of journal Health Years. Besides being reviewed for many international journals, his lectures and talks for popularization of science has inspired many young minds to pursue the passions in natural history, and he envisioned biology as integrative organism biology. So there is a lot of in sir records, but I briefly introduced you, sir, and forgive me if I am wrong anywhere. Uh, thank you, sir, and I will welcome you again on this podium. And now I request you to shower your knowledge and information to us, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Abhinay. So, thank you for the nice words, and by doing so, you have pushed me into a zone of high performance anxiety.
Thank you, sir.
So, let me share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So today I'm going to discuss about how biology has evolved over the time, and where do we stand? Where do we stand means that what is the role of biology in Indian scenario and how far we have progressed. Because it's a tough situation for the country now and internationally as well when we are dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, and most of the talks they are focusing on how the virus is evolving and how the vaccine is being developed and how we are trying to cope with it. But unfortunately, the basic sciences or the basic biological sciences where we can deal with this kind of pandemic in a much finer way, that is altogether missing. So my talk will revolve around that what is the role of evolutionary biology in such a scenario, and how far we have progressed in understanding the evolution or evolutionary biology, and what is our thought or whatever we have gathered in terms of knowledge, that where do we stand, and do we can we compete in such a scenario at international fora, or do we have sufficient kind of knowledge or resources to fight with such kind of situations. So this is the basic essence. So I'm an ardent admirer of Urdu poetry, and I would like to start with a couplet of Allama Iqbal, which says that खुदा तुझे किसी तूफान से आशना कर दे कि तेरे बहर की मौजों में इज़्तिराब नहीं. So when Allama Iqbal's son was heading for England for higher studies, so as the quote goes, it conveys that to make a person mature or to know more, one should be introduced some kind of storm, or one should know, or one should be introduced some kind of jolt in life. Since what I feel is the lack of passion and lack of restlessness, if it is missing, if the passion is missing, then the progress is missing. So whatever you do, since most of the undergraduate students are also joining, as I have been told by Professor Puneet Puri, so for to pursue your passion or learn with passion is the most important thing in life. If you lack passion, it means you are dead. So passion and restlessness and curiosity are the main ingredients with which you can be mature and you can learn more. Now, what I'm going to talk, so you can say in 45 minutes or an hour, this is a sort of talk which I have structured in a way that we can address various issues, which over the time I have felt that undergraduate students or even PG students, when they come to us or whenever they are in the universities, especially in North India and other parts of the region, and accepting those institutions like NCBS or Indian Institute of Science and ICES, our students face a lot of problems. There is a problem with the basic sciences. There is a problem with the understanding of subject, that how the subject should be taught and what are the lacunae, what we should learn, what kind of knowledge we should have, and where should we should focus. Because I feel if the perspective of a teacher ultimately becomes the perspective of a student. And so if our perspective is narrow, or it is not wide enough to convey whatever is there in the sciences or whatever is there in the biology, obviously that is going to impact the students as well as the country in longer run. So as the talk will go, first I'll discuss the historical perspective, that in terms of evolution or evolutionary biology, how we have grown, what is the history, because most of the time the historical perspective is wrong in the given textbooks which we generally teach at UG level or even at PG level. And if the history of something is missing, your knowledge is not complete, because you do not know how that science has progressed, how it has gone, and what are the ingredients, or what was the past, and what is the present, and what is going to be the future. Then second, the idea of common descent, which influences the modern taxonomy as well as the current biodiversity studies, that is the idea of common descent. I'll discuss it later. Then we have descent with modifications, that how the organisms or the populations or the species or the lineages, they get modified with time, and what type of constraints are there, what type of traits are modified, and how we perceive those modifications. Do we look in terms of morphology, or we look in terms of molecular studies, and what kind of data we have? So that is all is dealt with descent with modifications. Then natural selection. Over the time, I have realized that most of the time, the perception about natural selection is wrong. That whatever is written in the books or whatever is written in these scenarios, the students, they perceive it in a very different way. And the end result is that the impact is going to have on teaching as well as research. So then there will be some kind of misconceptions based on these ideas, that what kind of misconceptions we have generated, how we have misunderstood the subject, because it is always first there is misconception, then we misunderstand, and finally we misinterpret. So when we misinterpret, then we convey the idea to younger generation, and that is going to impact the teaching as well as the research. And how far we have progressed in terms of evolution or evolutionary synthesis, and what I personally feel, or is the need of our, instead of focusing on sort of fragmented approach, we should always focus on in a sort of holistic way, that is integrative organismal biology. That is the need of our. Now, how this all started, everyone about you is aware. That is not going to be the point over here. That it all started with Charles Robert Darwin, an English naturalist, and another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. Both came up with the idea of natural selection, and both came up with the idea of natural history, that how the populations evolve, how they change with time, and what kind of impact they have with respect to environment. But the unfortunate part of this is, like, as you know, that the Nobel Prize for DNA, double helical structure of DNA, most of the time we read in books that was given to Watson and Crick in 1962, although that was published in 1953. And the unfortunate part is that the Nobel Prize was given to three persons, Watson, Crick, and Willikens. Willikens was heading the lab where the X-ray diffraction photograph of DNA was taken. But most of the time, our books or our teachers or our students focus, if you ask them, the answer would be Watson and Crick in 1962. So these kind of, you can say, unsung heroes, which are there in science, the unsung actors, we lose them. And when we lose them, we do not discuss them, we do not discuss their contributions, then we lose a lot of information which is buried in the history, and that remains buried. Same thing happened over here. It is normally taught that Charles Robert Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection, but unfortunately it was also jointly proposed by both. And instead of calling it as theory of natural selection by Darwin Wallace, we mostly call it as Darwin's theory of natural selection, although the idea of natural selection, the idea of evolution, was also conceived by Alfred Russel Wallace at the very same time. So this is a historical perspective, that Darwin was not interested in publishing the theory or his observations, which he has kept close to his heart till many years. And one day in 1858, Wallace sent a letter to Darwin, which to Darwin's shock nearly replicated Darwin's own ideas. So this shock ultimately pushed Darwin to publish the book, which we now call it as Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And that was published in 1859. And the joint paper of both was read on 1st of July, 1858 in Linnean Society of London. So these ideas, they got together, and finally we got one of the most exhaustive and one of the most compelling theories of evolution, which we call as theory of natural selection. Now, these are some of the misconceptions, or these are some of the ideas which we generally misunderstand in terms of evolution. Now, first is natural selection. I'll discuss it in detail, that how we perceive natural selection. And second is survival of fittest, that how we perceive survival of the fittest, because the idea was coined by Herbert Spencer at a time when England has colonized most of the world. So instead of in terms of population genetics or in terms of fitness of genes, it was perceived that one might is right, because at that time England has colonized more rest of the world, and they thought might is right. So same idea or same perception was pushed into this theory, and the phrase was taken up by Darwin from Herbert Spencer as survival of the fittest, in terms of the strong the individual, the more fit is. Then descent with modifications. Then when we talk in terms of descent with modifications, we generally think that these populations or individuals, they get modified with time, and we get the generations with modifications. Now, what is natural selection? We generally perceive, most of the time, we generally perceive that natural selection is a guiding hand, that it is the natural selection which is pursuing everything, which is forcing everything to go in a particular direction. So it's a process. It's not a sort of guiding hand which is forcing the individuals or the populations in a particular direction. It has no direction. It is a simple result of variation, that if you have the variations, those variations, they are sort of props, or they are sort of raw material for selection to act upon. Those variations may be the product of mutations. They may be the product of, you can say, standing genetic variation, or maybe the product of sexual reproduction or recombination, or maybe the product of introgression, or maybe the product of admixing. So all those kind of variations, if they are present there, selection has a choice, or selection has a raw material to select upon. Then differential reproduction, that some reproduce at a higher rate and some reproduce at a lower rate. All these things matter the most when these traits are passed to next generation. If they are not passed to next generation, we cannot consider it as natural selection. Because when we think in terms of natural selection, we always think that the raw material is there, the variations are there. If an individual with variation reproduces at a higher rate, then the fitness is counted in terms of reproduction, whether the individual reproduces, or if it does not reproduce, then it is of no use. So it's a sort of mindless and mechanistic kind of view, and natural selection has no goal. It's a process which goes upon. Now, these are misconceptions which I have learned over time in teachers as well as students, how they perceive. They feel that natural selection, it involves organisms, they are trying to adapt, that it's a sort of guiding hand which involves organisms, how they should adapt to environment. So natural selection is not doing anything in terms of adaptation. Then the second misconception, it gives organisms what they need. It doesn't provide anything to organisms, then it acts for good of the species. Then natural selection is about survival of the very fittest individuals in a population. Then natural selection produces organisms perfectly suited to their environment. Then all traits of organisms are adaptation. That means if you have a whole sum of an organism, it doesn't mean all of the traits are meant for adaptations. Like there is a nice example from birds, that when they evolved wings, they were not meant for flight. They were meant for homeothermy, to maintain the body temperature, and eventually they were used for flight. So these kind of examples are there in evolutionary biology, where we generally misconceive or misunderstand natural selection in different ways. Now, this is a sort of idea which nowadays influences, you can say, taxonomy as well as uh, other fields. That what is tree of life? Even now, day before yesterday, there was a paper that they have revised tree of life. So the first idea about tree of life, that the idea of common descent, it's a very powerful idea. That was first by Darwin, and he later published in Origin of Species in 1859. So tree of life, or basically the descent, idea of common descent, was first proposed by others also, like Ernest Haeckel, then Darwin also. So this was a hand drawing which appeared in Origin, and you can see here that he has shown that how individuals or populations or species, because the idea of species was not prevalent at his time. So how these individuals or how these populations, they bifurcate, or how they divide, and how we have a common ancestor, and from that common ancestor, this kind of diversity have arisen. So he was skeptical, but he has an insight which is proved later, that's why he used the phrase "I think." Now, this is a major problem. Whenever I have been into lectures in Inspire programs or other places, or this is a kind of situation which we encounter while teaching, or most of the time we teach the same way. And this is a question which we face most of the time. Every now and then they say that if we have evolved from apes, why are there still apes? And this is a tweet which I have taken, and when this tweet was published, it got more than 50,000 likes. That this is a sort of question which we do not know, and what kind of this is a sort of rhetoric which is attached with evolution. And interestingly, for a layman or a person without scientific aptitude, we can say that one can think this way. But you will be surprised to know, or many of you might be knowing, in the last central government, one of the ministers, well educated, although he said the same way, that if we have evolved from monkeys, why there are monkeys in the forests, or why there are not humans in the forests? So this kind of perception is a sort of linear progression, which is completely misunderstood. That is, you can see the cartoon over here. They say ape has gradually modified. And finally, there is an addition. If you go to Google, or if you go to search engines, there is an addition, and most of the students and teachers are fascinated by that addition. Here, the posture is erect, the last one. And then after that, they show a human species with a mobile in hand, and say there is a technological revolution. But the idea remains the same, that is linear progression, that from ape we have gradually modified as humans. So this is our perception of evolution, that how we think in terms of evolution, that is a gradual progression from ape to man. So now, from where these misconceptions have started, from where these things have started, that why do we think like this way? Because if it is in books, or if it is in the minds of students as well as teachers, it means there is a problem in understanding the concept of evolution, or there is a problem with perceiving the concept of evolution, or we do not know. Because most of the time, if you see undergraduate books as well as some of the sometimes PG books, they are not in terms of concepts. We have a sort of a designed curriculum on which, because when we think in terms of curricula, or when we think in terms of syllabi, there are set guidelines, and you do not deviate from those guidelines. You always focus on these guidelines. You find a chapter, and suddenly you find theories of evolution. There's no history, there is no historical backdrop, there are no concepts. Suddenly you start with the heading Lamarck's theory of evolution. Then you come up with some sort of description. Then you say there are some problems. It was rejected. Then you come up with August Weismann's experiments. Then you go to Darwin's theory of evolution. Then there are 3-4 points where you say differential reproduction, variation, survival of the fittest, and so, natural selection. And then you say neo-Darwinism, but there is no correlation among these things. So this kind of correlation is most important, because whenever I teach students and whatever I feel, we divide biology into compartments. We have a fragmented approach. We say botany, we say zoology, we say biotechnology, we say molecular biology. Why don't we treat biology as a whole? Because if you see books of some prominent authors, you can see that if you are looking at developmental biology, they won't start, if it is prescribed to a zoology student, they won't start it with sort of life cycle of human beings or life cycle of some animal. They will start it with volvox, they will come with cellular slime mold, then they will come with chlamydomonas, then they will come with eulothrix, then acellular, cellular slime molds, and eventually they will end up with higher organisms. So this kind of correlation is entirely missing. And when this kind of correlation is missing in our books or in our teaching, then obviously these kind of misconceptions are bound to arise. Now, the first misconception was Ernest Haeckel. He produced a tree that was like Darwin, after Darwin, 1866. And if you look at the tree, it has a trunk but minimal branches. So what an impression this tree gives to a you can say student or a teacher, that we generally say, most of the time we say, this started with Aristotle, that evolution is a sort of evolutionary history, or evolution is a sort of ladder of progress. Ladder of progress means it's a gradual steps which we are following. And this all started with Aristotle's scala naturae view of life, and this continued up to Haeckel and later with Linnaeus. So here what we presume, or most of the time we presume in our teaching, that an extant amoeba species is ancestral to humans. Like I stated in my earlier slide, we presume that apes are ancestral to humans. Same way we perceive an extant amoeba species, it has gradually become multicellular, and slowly it has given rise to higher organisms. And similarly, we think that extant amphibians are ancestral to snakes. So this kind of thinking, or this kind of perception, if we keep on pursuing, or if we keep on processing it, obviously it will impact the teaching as well as the research. Like I said earlier, that in a COVID-19 situation, when it started last year, nobody thought that it could mutate. Then suddenly we had the mutants. Then we started thinking of antigenic drift, that there is an antigenic drift in the virus. Now we say there is mutant 1, there is mutant 4, there is mutant 5. Where is the lacuna? Because we do not have sufficient institutes or sufficient resources. We have the resources or institutes now. We are looking at the genome, but we are not able to understand why it is evolving. What are the reasons which are forcing this kind of evolution? Now we know, we generally discover there is a mutant, fine. Now the next question is whether the vaccine will work against this mutant or not, fine. Then you think this is sort of arms race. Virus is mutating, and you are also trying to cope with it with the help of design of vaccines. This kind of situation, but the basic understanding or the basic thinking that what are the factors which are leading to evolution and why it is evolving, what kind of environmental factors are there, what kind of situation is there, what kind of reasons are there for this kind of mutability, that is entirely missing. Now, we call Carl Linnaeus and as a father of taxonomy. And if you start reading taxonomy books, or you can say taxonomy literature, the first question we generally ask our students, who is the father of taxonomy? And generally the answer is Carl von Linnaeus. Fine. He was the person who gave the binomial nomenclature for the first time, and he came up, although there were few contributions of Aristotle also, binomial nomenclature. Then he started with scientific classification, then a hierarchical classification system, and father of we call him as father of modern taxonomy. Now, if you go to the books, you will suddenly find there is a chapter, if I correctly remember, systematics in undergraduate books, either +2 level or in BSc, and that goes even up to MSc or post graduation. And if you start with that chapter, you suddenly find systematics, and then there's a whole sum of paragraph on Carl von Linnaeus that was in 1758, 1759. His first book was published, and that was the binomial nomenclature, how it started, how we started working on that. And then we come up with the different kind of ideas. Then suddenly we come up with this kind of situation which we generally face, and then we ask student how many obligate categories are there. Then the answer is 7, because there are set defined rules that kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that is a kind of hierarchical classification, or that is a kind of classification most of the time we follow and most of the time we write. Now, what is my problem with this is, or what is the problem of biology or science with this? It is good to have a classification. It is good to have a sort of idea that how these, how the things are organized. But Linnaeus' idea predates the origin. That means predates the origin of species that was published by Darwin. It got published in 1859, and this idea appeared in 1759. Because the first edition which Linnaeus published, that was in 1735, in which he placed whales among fishes based on their similarities, habitat similarity, or maybe based on some sort of morphological similarity. So there were a lot of misclassifications at that point of time. So this kind of classification or this kind of thinking does not reflect the natural relationships, that how the organisms are naturally organized, how they are related with one another, and what kind of characters are there on the basis of which this kind of classification should. It is good in terms of, you can say, discovering or describing species. Until or unless you're describing, it's good, because you are following a set rules, you are following a set pattern. But as far as the natural relationships are concerned, this kind of hierarchy or this kind of thinking creates some sort of problems. And this was rightly addressed in 1966 by a German biologist, and interestingly, he fought in World War II also, Willy Henning. He came up with an idea that whole life on Earth, or whole life over here, is basically a product of cladogenesis. So you get a paragraph in your books at undergraduate level, cladogenesis, but there's no mention of Willy Henning. And there are few definitions, and you end up with definitions, and there is no historical perspective. There is no historical connection that how we have come to this and how the science has progressed in this direction, and what are the reasons why we think in this way. So he came up with the idea that, although the interesting part was that the book which is on the bottom of this slide, this was published in German, and it was published in German, and later on it was translated to English. And some of the authors or some of the writers or some of the followers of biology still claim that the book lost the essence when it was translated. Fine, but still we got what he wanted to say. He said that whole of the life is a product of cladogenesis. That means splitting and branching, and there is an ancestor from which different organisms or different sort of lineages, or we can say species, they have originated, and somehow we are related to one another. If I say we are related to amoeba, yes. We are related to sponges, yes. Somehow we are related to one another because there is a common ancestor, although it could be that to some we are distantly related and to some we are closely related. Like if I say we are closely related to chimpanzee and we are distantly related to amoeba, so that is the main essence of this. So he came up with the idea of cladogenesis, that organisms should be classified on the basis of branching, or on the basis of their ancestral history, on the basis of their relationships, what we call as natural relationships. Now, if you look at the slide which was there earlier, now this was the linear progression which creates the problem, or which has plagued our thinking, or which has created a sort of malaise for our thinking. Now, how it should be perceived? How it has happened from past to present, there was a common ancestor, and from this common ancestor, these different lineages or these different organisms or species, you can say, or populations, they have split and they have come up. Like we have gorilla here, there is a speciation event, there's a branching event, and here we have human beings, then we have chimpanzee, and then we have bonobo. So this kind of situation is there. So answer to that question is, it's not a linear progression. We have not evolved. We have not evolved from apes, but we had shared a common ancestor with apes. So that kind of situation is there. We share a common ancestor from past to present, and how far the evolution has progressed. But unfortunately, the first idea which I have shown earlier, that still haunts the mind of now. If you when I said he came up with an idea of cladogenesis, that is branching, if you think in terms of these orangutan, gorilla, human, chimpanzee, and bonobo, they form a complete group. It means from here they have gone and they have diversified. So that kind of situation and that kind of natural classification, or that kind of natural group which ultimately reflects their natural relationships, is basically hominidae. And if we go further back, then if we include gibbon into that, then we get hominidia, that is apes. So it means we are human beings are also apes. And if we include new world monkeys as well as old world monkeys, then our ancestor is over here, and from that ancestor the branching pattern or cladogenesis or the splitting has occurred, and slowly all these species, they have gone to their own path, and they are evolving in their own directions. So it doesn't mean that old world monkeys are primitive or we are more advanced, because mostly we use that kind of language, that human species is more advanced, human species is more evolved. So that is not the situation. We have diversified, or we have split at different times, and at different times rates of evolution are different for different organisms. So when rates of evolution are different for different organisms, it means they evolve at different rates, and their response or their results are entirely different. And as I said earlier, still we face a lot of problems. Like if you open those books up to even MSc level or postgraduate level, you will find first you will come up with Pisces, then you will come up with amphibians, then you will come up with reptiles, then you will come up with AVs, and then you come up with mammals. So this kind of classification we still promote, or we still say this kind of classification is correct, but this is wrong. Reptilia as a group is not natural. If you think in terms of characters, if we consider it as a natural group, you can see on the slide that mammals and birds should also be included in it. But we have excluded those to keep it as reptilia in terms of linear classification. And then this is the problem, because this does not reflect natural relationship. And if we do not know that it does not reflect natural relationship, what we are going to tell the students? Because we do not know the background, we do not know how these things have evolved, how these things are related, what are their natural relationships, how they have come up. Then the kind of system which we are promoting, that is a sort of artificial system, although we should keep in mind, or although for sake of reference, we should keep this thing that, okay, this is a sort of classification which is based on linear taxonomy, and this is a sort of classification which is more natural, more phylogenetic, which reflects the more sort of natural history or natural relationships. So we can do it only if we have that kind of background, or if we have that kind of background knowledge or that kind of thinking. Now, as I said earlier, that it is always misleading to think of an extant amoeba species as ancestral to humans, or an extinct amphibian as ancestral to snakes. So evolution has continued in amoeba as well as in the amphibians. It keeps on going. And which is oldest, which is youngest, which is ancestral, which is more derived, which is more primitive, which is more advanced, which is more simple, which is more complex, this is all nonsense. Every organism, every lineage is going in its own direction. And when the lineage is moving in its own direction, it means it is facing different type of constraints, different kind of environmental, you can say constraints, different type of environmental problems, and it is responding in a different kind of way. Like I think a few days earlier, there was a research on fish coelacanth, and most of the time in our books it is mentioned that coelacanth is a living fossil. And we teach students that coelacanth is a living fossil, and it means when we say living fossil, we assume that there is no change in the genome, there is no change in the genotype, or there is no change in the genes which constitute that organism. And finally, when they analyzed the genome, they found that the changes are there. Changes are occurring in that fish also, but the rate is different, or they are not being expressed in that sense as they do in other organisms. So what we perceive in terms of morphology, the changes are not visible. And based on that, if we see the fish as a whole, we say it is the same over millions of years, and then we say it is living fossil. So it is not living fossil, it is undergoing changes. And when we say living fossil, sometimes we also say it is ancestral, it is primitive, it is simple, it is not complex. So that kind of thinking ultimately ends up nowhere. Now, rather, instead of focusing of an organism, what we should on what we should focus. It's not the organism we are thinking. We always think in terms of characters or traits. So we can simply say, instead of saying that organism is more evolved or less evolved, it's not the organism which is more evolved, it's the trait which is more evolved, or it's the character which is more evolved. And how that character and how that trait might look in the ancestor, how it was ancestor, and how it got modified with time, how many changes it has gone with time, and what characters are there at present, and what are undergoing changes, and what are facing trade-offs, or what we can say, what are facing some constraints that they are not evolving. So coming to the second part of my talk, the first was dealing with linear taxonomy and how far we have progressed and how it has influenced in our thinking, and how we need to think in a different way. Now, the second part is that when Darwin proposed the theory, this is also quite pertinent. When I will conclude, you will come to know that why I have included all this kind of stuff. So as far as modern evolutionary synthesis is concerned, we generally see in books neo-Darwinism. So we come up with an idea, neo-Darwinism. Then sometimes we say modern evolutionary synthesis. So what is modern evolutionary synthesis or neo-Darwinism? Because the idea of natural selection and the idea of common descent was so powerful. I think in the history of mankind, Darwin's book of Origin of Species is the best monument which ever has been produced. So in terms of Darwinian thinking, modern evolutionary synthesis, the problem with Darwin was, he said there are variations, there is selection which is looking for those variations, they act as raw material. The problem was that there was no backup from the genetics, because as all of you know, that at point of time, Darwin almost overshadowed Mendel. When Mendel was overshadowed, the laws of inheritance were not known to public, and later on they were rediscovered in 1900 by three scientists independently, Sharmark, Carl Correns, and Hugo D.A.V. And after that, the scientists started thinking that Darwin was right in the sense that there are some factors, there are some sort of genes which are transmitted from parents to offsprings, and based on those genes, variations can be transmitted, or we can say fitness, in terms of fitness, some sort of differential reproduction, they can be transmitted from parents to offsprings. So this kind of backup was provided by Mendelian laws, and then this whole concept was revised in terms of modern evolutionary synthesis by input from various scientists, and like Ernest Mayr, who you might have read, the students might have read biological species concept, who pioneered that biological species concept. Then Sewell Wright, for whom you read genetic drift and Sewell Wright effect. Then Ronald Fisher, most of the time we use in research ANOVA, analysis of variance. He was a statistician in England and worked a lot on population genetics. And most of the time you asked, name a scientist who settled in India, that is JBS Haldane. Then a Russian scientist, Dobzhansky, who migrated from Russia to US and then eventually worked on Drosophila. Then we have Junial Huxley, then Gaylord Simpson, mostly worked on plantiology, fossils, and G.L. Stebbins, who worked on plants, and mostly his work is related to polyploidy. So they came up with an idea that everything should be combined, genes should be combined, population thinking, level thinking should be there, and then Darwinian natural selection should be there, and all those factors combined together they lead to evolution, or they lead to in terms of evolutionary thinking, or that was proposed as evolutionary synthesis. But that is not my prerogative to discuss it over here. But the purpose or the basic essence of this modern evolutionary synthesis was that they provided that phenotype has direct link to genotype. That is, as you know already, the students know that phenotype is a physical or morphological manifestation of genotype. So they directly linked genotype with phenotype, that whatever is there in genes, that is expressed in terms of phenotype mostly. And they said that they provided the genic relationship between genotype as well as phenotype, that whatever is transmitted from generation to generation, that is expressed in phenotype, and whatever we visualize, that is in terms of phenotype. So the basic essence was that is sort of genic thinking. But at that point of time, there was a scientist, Waddington, British embryologist. He did some experiments with Drosophila, and he came up with, you can say, alarming results. And he said that, okay, fine, there are genes, whatever is written in or coded in genes, that is expressed in phenotype. Agreed, it happens this way because you people have correlated genes with phenotype. That is agreeable, that is fine. But whatever he found based on experiments, he said that there is something else which works during the expression of genes, and that also modulates, or that also changes the phenotype. So his ideas, first when he proposed these ideas, they thought that Waddington is supporting Lamarckism, because as you know, Lamarck said that whatever we develop during our lifetime, that is transmitted. So same thing, same idea, he thought that it is the same idea which is being promoted by Waddington. But Waddington was hardcore Darwinian man, and he said, no, it is not like that. It is, what I am trying to say is, genes are there, the coded information is as such, but when there is a sort of development, there are different kind of expressions. Now we know at present transcriptomes, we call them as transcriptomes, or we know that how genes are regulated or how their expression is regulated. So that kind of expression for the first time was proposed by Waddington, and now we know that science as epigenetics. So the term epigenetics was coined by Waddington, and epigenetics means above genetics. That is something which works above the level of genes. So, and he also said that there are certain traits which do not get modified by this kind of modification, or by this kind of gene expression. And the best example, you can say, 5 fingers in human hand. So that is a sort of trait which rarely gets modified with respect to environment. Although we know there is sort of incomplete and complete penetrance that is related to genes, but this trait cannot be modified with the help of regulation of gene expression or change in gene expression if a person has inherited the genes for 5 fingers. So that kind of situation is there. This is known as genetic robustness or canalization, that the traits which do not get modified with respect to environment, they are called canalized traits. Suppose you have populations of 2 insects and you put them into different environments, and those populations, their behavior, their physiology does not undergo change, and they remain the same in a different kind of environments. So we would say that those populations are canalized. They do not undergo changes with respect to change in environment. Then in 1972, there was an uproar, and these 2 scientists, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, Gould died of cancer in 2003, but Eldredge is still alive. So they came up with an idea that is punctuated equilibrium. So as we know in English, punctuation is when we stop a sentence somewhere, or we want that it should be, there should be a pause somewhere, or there should be some sort of gap before we speak further. So this punctuated equilibrium, theory of punctuated equilibrium, and I was pained to see in books that it is rarely addressed. Although we do not agree with the idea of Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, but it has some relevance in terms of history. So Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, when they proposed this theory, the impact of this theory was so huge in 1972. Then when the paper appeared in a journal, then what happened? British Broadcasting Service, BBC, which was a prominent broadcasting service at that point of time, they stopped the broadcast in between, and the announcer announced that a new theory for evolution has been proposed, which refutes Darwin's theory of evolution, and they named it as punctuated equilibria. So that was the impact at that time. So what they said, that lineages or species or populations, they remain in a period of stasis. Period of stasis means in a period of no change, and suddenly they split. That there is a maximum period of no change or stasis, then suddenly those species, they split into two populations, they split or eventually get differentiated, they get diverged and become new species. And this they reported in fossils, and this is known as stasis. But this was quite opposite to what Darwin said, that there is a gradual speciation, that slowly populations, they have variations, they evolve to, and they evolve in response to environment, and then they are, some of the traits are selected, then slowly the evolution occurs. But here they said that most of the time there is a stasis, there is a stoppage, and suddenly the populations, they diverge. So there was a sort of miscalculation on Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, because they worked with fossils. And when they proposed this theory, whenever you work with fossils, you do not get whole of the fossil series. And based on that, it is always difficult to make some generalizations until you get the whole of the fossil record. Now, as I said earlier, that epigenetics. So this is some sort of a beautiful example from my field where I work on ants, that whenever a female or the queen lays eggs, the genome is same. That means the same type of genes are present in all the eggs. That is, if you look at genes at that point of time, the coded information is almost same, the nucleotides are the same, the pattern is same, but with the period of time, some of the you can say larvae or some of the eggs, they develop into major workers, some they develop into queens, some they develop into males. So from one genotype or from one genome, we have different sort of expressions. And when we have different sort of expressions, so our theory or our thinking about that whatever is in genes is expressed in phenotypes is a little bit challenged, in the sense that there is something else which plays a role in between. And that something else is basically epigenetics. So that is being influenced. That means genes expression or genes regulation is guided or influenced by some sort of other chemicals. I won't go into details. For example, there is histone modification, there's DNA methylation. So all those factors eventually influence the genotype, and then that leads to type of different sort of expressions. Now, this is a nice book if the students or teachers can go through this. Mary Jane Westford, she worked a lot on developmental plasticity, and she refuted or she challenged the idea what we teach in, I discussed earlier, modern evolutionary synthesis. She said that you always ignore development in terms of evolution. The phenotype which is available to selection, whenever we think that this organism is more fit or this organism is more viable or more you can say fit to environment. So that is, she said that development has to play a major role in the formation of that phenotype. So the basic idea was that development as a whole should also be included in the evolutionary thinking, that how the developmental pathways, how the regulatory chemicals during development, they are being influenced by environment, and how they regulate the formation of different phenotypes. And ultimately phenotypes are basically the products which face the environment or which are exposed to environment. And based on that kind of interaction between phenotype and environment, there's a chance for selection to act. So this is known as developmental plasticity, and sometimes it is also known as a sort of phenotypic plasticity. So I'll come to this later with few pictures. So this is a nice, you can say, illustration between genotype and phenotype. As I said earlier, when I said that there is a gap between genotype and phenotype, we always assume that whatever is in the genes will be expressed in the phenotype or will be there in morphology. So this kind of thinking is there, but no. Now in between we have environment also, we have development also. So this is a nice illustration from Stephen Steen's Evolutionary Medicine book, from where I have taken this. So need not to go in details. I would simplify it for the students that here we have a phenotype space. That means here we have different phenotypes, and here we have genotype. That means whatever is coded in genes, and then these genes, they interact they interact with ecology, they interact with environment, and then eventually there's a sort of interaction during developmental period also. So out of that interaction we get the phenotypes. That means directly from genes to phenotype is not the story. That whenever we have some genes in gametes like sperm or egg, then finally those genes are there in zygote or spore, that they are acted upon by ecology, they are acted upon by environment, behavior, then there is an influence of development, and finally we get the phenotype. So direct interaction between genotype and phenotype space is not there. It is influenced by multiple factors. Now, based on this, they proposed different synthesis, that is extended evolutionary synthesis. First, we discussed that was modern evolutionary synthesis. Now we think in terms of extended evolutionary synthesis, that we should include different kind of parameters or different kind of sciences or different kind of thinking or different kind of thought process or whatever knowledge we have gained over time to make up a broader view that how evolution operates or how evolution influences or which factors influences an organism. Like earlier we said, it is only natural selection. And I discussed various, you can say, misconceptions, misinterpretations, misunderstanding about natural selection. But now we think it should not be only the guiding, you can say, only the process which is there for evolution. We should also include developmental processes, like we should also include ecology, we should also include environment, and all together they act together on an organism, and organism as a whole is the unit on which different forces will act. And second, genetic inheritance. As I said, that genes, they are transmitted from, everybody knows genes are transmitted or they are inherited from parents to offspring. And there was a direct relation after Darwin's theory in modern evolutionary synthesis, that genes, they produce the phenotype. Now they say not the genes, as I said earlier, there are other factors also. So instead of saying genetic inheritance, we should consider inclusive inheritance. Inclusive inheritance means we should include or we should consider all the factors together, so that we can think that they also influence the inheritance. Then we have random genetic variation versus non-random phenotypic variation. That means, as I said earlier, genetic variation is random, natural selection is non-random. Because if you have the raw material or if you have different variations whenever they are produced by mutations or due to introgression or due to admixing or due to other factors, they do not have a direction. The variations are there. They are basically props which we can use during dance shows, and from out of those props, one will be favored and one will be better as compared to others. So that's why I said genetic variation is random, selection is non-random. So they say phenotypic variation should also be included in that. Then gradualism. When we say gradualism, we assume it's a sort of gradual, like we say graduated. Graduated, we say 1, 2, 3, 4 in that direction. When we say gradualism versus variable rates of change, that during evolution, variable rates of change are there. As I said, that some organisms, they evolve at different rates. Some organisms, they evolve at faster rates. Then we should change our perspective. We should change our perspective in the sense that we have gene-centered perspective versus organism-centered perspective. Because this is something which needs attention in the sense in institutes or in, say, in universities or in minds of persons who deal basically policymakers. When we say molecular biology, or then we say other kind of biology, it is not correct to use the term molecular biology, because biology is a wholesome subject. It should be taken as organismal biology. Whatever characteristic of an organism you are looking at, whether it is a development or you are looking at molecules or you're looking at different aspects, it means you are looking at organism as a whole. If you look at organisms as a whole, then your perspective will change. So same is the situation over here. Instead of looking at genes, that gene-centered perspectives, we should have organism-centered perspective, that we should look at how the organism as a whole responds to that kind of situation or that kind of selection pressures or that kind of constraints or that kind of environment in which that organism is exposed. Then macroevolution by microevolution. Again, these definitions are there. If you suddenly ask a student of even graduation or post-graduation, if you ask the definition of macroevolution, the immediate answer would be formation of higher phyla. That is adaptive radiation of those phyla like kingdom, phylum, and if kingdom and phylum are produced or kingdom or phyla are produced, then it is macroevolution. Then if it occurs at species level, this is microevolution. So this is another misconception. If evolution occurs at a larger scale or influences those traits or those characters which are going to influence the fitness of that organism in a particular environment, that is macroevolution. If I say I have a macroevolutionary point of view, it means I'm looking evolution at a larger scale. Instead of saying that there's an adaptive radiation, dinosaurs, they got extinct, then mammals, they went diversification, that was a macroevolutionary event. So that is not the situation. And microevolution is basically when it occurs at population level, when we have different kind of populations, and different populations, they respond to different selection pressures, they respond to different environmental factors, and there are changes in allele frequencies from generation to generation. Like in undergraduate or postgraduate level, you come up with Hardy-Weinberg law. So you deal with type of allele frequencies, that how those allele frequencies, they change with time. Even when that law is taught, we generally say p square plus q square plus 2pq equal to 1. And when you ask the student what is the purpose of this law, what is the significance of studying this law, nobody knows. That is a null hypothesis, that we assume that it happens in ideal conditions. Fine, it happens in ideal conditions, but we need to know if conditions change, then what would happen. And then the law will tell us which factors have influenced, whether it is mutation or it is gene flow or it is selection which has influenced or which has skewed those frequencies from normal. So we need to think in terms of broader perspective. Now, as I said earlier, phenotypic plasticity. Here you can see there are nice pictures of grasshopper. One phase is gregarious and other is solitary. So species is same, genes are same, nucleotide sequence is same, but we have two different results. So these two different results are response to different environment, or you can say in terms of density crowding experiment. So this kind of situation, this is known as phenotypic plasticity. So it means when same genes were there in the egg, but they have come up with two different phenotypes. When they have come up with two different phenotypes, it means something else has acted upon genes in response to environment. And when something else has acted upon and we have different phenotypes, we call it as phenotypic plasticity. So the purpose of this is that when we think in terms of phenotypic plasticity, it means these two different phenotypes are produced in response to environment. And obviously these two different phenotypes, they are in response to different environment. So they have different kind of fitness in different kind of environment. See here in butterflies also, this we call as polyphenism, like they say seasonal forms, that is in different seasons, they produce different type of patterns. So when they produce different kind of patterns, earlier the taxonomists used to classify them as different species, or but they are not different species. That is the response of a genome, that is the response of same genome to different kind of environment. Now, generally, most of the time we say phenotypic plasticity. So when we say phenotypic plasticity, we assume, this I also wanted to discuss in the sense, because when we say phenotype, we automatically, our mind assumes morphology. That is morphological stance or morphological appearance or morphological expression or morphological countenance. So that is not the situation. Phenotype plasticity is basically plasticity or variation in morphology, physiology, behavior, or life history in response to changing environmental conditions. So if you say changes in physiology, but no changes in morphology, changes in behavior, changes in life history in response to environment, that is also phenotypic plasticity. And that could be brought up by different kind of factors, abiotic, then maybe spatial factors or temporal factors. And when an organism's homeostasis destabilized with respect to environment. Obviously, development or phenotypic plasticity aids to fitness or provides fitness. So this appeared last year, I think 2019 in proceedings. Then they said that everything should be included, that processes that contribute to inheritance. It is not like you can see over here, mutation, recombination, gene expression, then we have developmental processes, epigenetics, regulatory, then we have ecology, and finally we have new phenotypes, then development. And all those processes, I won't go into details, all those processes finally lead to phenotypic evolution, and eventually it is the phenotype which would interact with the environment and which would provide the desired fitness. Now, this is a nice picture up here in the same paper, that here we have genotype. It is acted upon by environment. We have variations in environment, or we have some, you exclude this noise, then we have some variations in the genes also, that is known as allelic variation. Then we have variations in the environment. Then same genotype, when these things are pooled together or filtered together, where in response to environment, then development again plays a major role, and eventually we get the phenotype. So it is not only the genotype which is replicated, or which we can say is translated into phenotype exactly. It is acted upon by various factors, and those various factors, they combine together to produce the phenotype. So we need to change our view in this process. So as I said earlier, in a COVID situation, if we do not think biology in terms of evolution, this is a quote which has been quoted multiple times. This is by Dobzhansky, when he said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That if you do not think in terms of evolution, or if you do not think in terms of how the processes are taking up or how they are shaping the organisms, there is no sense in doing biology. But better than this, there's another quote by Peter. He was awarded Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1960. He says that the alternative to thinking in evolutionary terms is not to think at all. That if you do not think in terms of evolutionary terms, better you people don't think at all, because that is not going to help, and that is not going to produce any result at all. And nowadays, all the subjects are being integrated together, and we are coming up with ideas like we have how ecology influences evolution in terms of resources, in terms of you can say competition, like we have interspecific, intraspecific competition, and how these processes then finally in terms of evolution, they are inherited and eventually they are acted upon by developmental biology. And this kind of situation is there, and this was also published in 2019. Now we have a kind of situation, eco, evo, devo. So this kind of situation is there, that whenever you look at an organism, your perspective should not be narrow, it should be wide in terms. My purpose is that these undergraduate students or even these postgraduate students, whenever they go to higher institute or whenever they go to in their research, the perspective should be wide. It should not be like this, that you have given a problem and you are focusing on that problem only, and you do not know what is going on in the organism or whatever else is there which you need to look upon, which you need to observe. So this kind of eco, evo, devo thinking is there. And this guy was awarded Nobel Prize on his work in Caenorhabditis elegans nematode, and there's a lot of work which is still going on this nematode. So look at the thinking which he had, that biologists ask only 3 questions. Where does it come from? That is evolution. Then they start thinking, how does it work? That is in terms of physiology. How is it made? That is in terms of developmental biology. And eventually you integrate everything. When you integrate everything, then you can think in terms of that particular organism, that how that organism as a whole is responding, how the processes are integrated to each other. So I call it as integrative organismal biology. That is, the students should look upon biology as integrative organismal biology. Compartmentalized knowledge or fragmented knowledge in terms of botany, zoology, or in terms of biotechnology, or in terms of other disciplines, it is fine that we we demarcate them so that they flourish well. We have different kind of thinking, but it is always better that we have a holistic thinking, or we have a combined thinking in that sense. So this was a quote by Stephen Jay Gould. He said, if you replay the tape of life and started all over again, the end result would be very different. So many people have different ideas about this quote, but what I feel is that what he is trying to convey is that the end result would be different, because the organisms will be exposed to different kind of selection pressures. If you replay the tape of life, that means if you start it over again, they will be exposed to different kind of pressures, and that would lead to different kind of situation or different kind of endpoints. And let me share one thing with you. I have been a student of D.A.V College, Jalandhar. I did my pre-medical, and it's a bit nostalgic to deliver a talk over here. So I would like to quote few lines of Sahir Ludhianvi, that "ए सरज़मीने पाक के याराना नेक नाम, बासद खलूस शायरे आवारा का सलाम, ए वादी ए जमील मेरे दिल की धड़कने, आदाब कह रही हैं तेरी बारगाह में, दौरे खिजा में भी तेरी कलियां खिली रहें, ताहशर ये हसीन फ़ज़ाएं बसी रहें, गाए हैं इस फ़ज़ा में वफ़ाओं के राग भी, नगमाते आतिशी से बिखेरी है आग भी, सरकश बने हैं गीत बगावत के गाए हैं, वर्षों ने निज़ाम के नक्शे बनाए हैं, नगमा निशाते रूह का गाया है बारहा, गीतों में आंसुओं को छुपाया है बारहा." सो फाइनली आई वुड से, इस सरजमी पे आज हम एक बार ही सही, दुनिया हमारे नाम से बेजार ही सही, लेकिन हम इन फजाओं के पाले हुए तो हैं. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I would love to answer.
Thank you very much, sir. So we were not knowing about this fact that you are an alumnus of D.A.V Jalandhar. I came to know just now only.
Okay. So I used to stay in Meherchand Hostel.
Yeah, it's there, sir.
Yeah, and Professor S.C. Sharma taught me zoology. And
Steve Sharma, he's
Steve
still.
Sharma.
Ji,
Still. And then chemistry Professor S.C. Puri was there.
Yes, yes.
And I think physics, it was Angi sir.
Angi, K.L. Angi.
And K.L. Angi.
Yes,
And
K.L. Angi.
English, it was, I think, Professor Bodhraj.
Joseph Bodhraj, yes.
Yeah.
Lala Bodhraj.
Yes.
Yes.
So those were the days when we used to stay there.
They were all my teachers also, sir.
Okay. And they were so dedicated, because I still remember when Professor Sri Sharma used to teach, he used to get furious if we do not focus, and he would make us stand up and then abuse us that you are not focusing what I am teaching.
He was a wonderful teacher, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, thanks for illuminating our minds in the light of evolution on the various concepts. So
Okay.
I was wondering about one concept, the living fossils, as you told that technically only those organisms which are not changing genetically, so they come. So isn't it that in this way, all the examples we are teaching our students, they are like exceptions? I mean, they are not really living fossils. So, or is there any real example as per the technical definition stands?
No,
And
basically, yeah.
and there is one part other also, if there is any like if that stands this technical definition, that isn't everything under natural selection then prone to the change in its genes or genetic makeup, so because evolution is still on. So that's it.
So I would answer your question in two different parts. Now, as far as first part is concerned, living fossil, because these definitions have come up maybe when we do not have access to genomes, or when we use not to think in terms of genomes. We used to have look at the morphology or the outer appearance or the phenotype, then we say there is no change. Now, as I put an example of coelacanth, even you can say a couple of weeks earlier, it was thought that it is not undergoing any change. But when they analyzed the genome, then they found there are changes. Now, if we think in terms of evolution, it is not always in terms of those changes which affect the fitness, because there are changes which are undergoing in an organism, but they may not affect fitness. Like there was a theory proposed by neutral theory of evolution, where they said that molecules, or you can say the genetic makeup, it keeps undergoing changes, and those changes, they may not add to the fitness. So when we look in a fitness way, or in terms of fitness, we think in terms of natural selection, because that neutral theory of evolution by Kimura, that was thought as a setback to Darwin's theory of evolution. But now we know that Kimura was right, but it is not a setback to Darwinism. There are some changes which finally do not manifest in terms of fitness. Like you might have heard of synonymous mutations. So if some mutations occur at the level of genomes and the end product is same, which do not influence the fitness, then the change is there, but that change is not recognized. So it means change is there at the level of molecules, but the end product, like if I say in terms of enzymes, what we need, we look at the active site. If there are some changes in amino acids, and those amino acids, if the amino acid is changed, like we have degeneracy in genetic code. So when we say degeneracy in genetic code, it means we have 20 amino acids and we have 61 codons. It means that more than one codon can code for amino acid. So that kind of situation is there. If active site is not hampered, change is there in the amino acid, or change is there in one or two base pairs, but the final product is same. Although the change is there is evolution. It is not influencing, but it is neutral evolution. So it means there are changes which are occurring at the level of organisms. So if they are not manifested in phenotype or in morphology, then we have used this term living fossil. So mostly it is now like cockroach, Periplasma americana, we say it is a living fossil. In crab also we say it is a living fossil. Until or unless these molecules are analyzed in these organisms, then we would see that whether these definitions stand the test of time.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Any other query if anyone is having? Now, before I request our treasurer of Darwin Zoological Society to propose a vote of thanks, I request everyone to kindly switch on their camera so that we can have a screenshot for our Facebook page of Zoology Department, D.A.V College Jalandhar. I request everyone to kindly switch on their cameras so that we can have a screenshot for our Facebook page. Thank you very much.
My dear colleagues and budding scientists of the department, I, Pooja Sharma, extend a warm vote of thanks to one and all involved in the success of this webinar named The Growth of Biological Thought. हिमेंद्र सर, आप डेफिनेटली इस जमीन से बेजार नहीं है, क्योंकि मेरी नजरों में और हम सबकी नजरों में आपकी इज्जत कई गुना बढ़ गई है, हमारी खुशी कई गुना बढ़ गई जब आपने बताया कि यू आर एन एल्यूमिनस ऑफ दिस कॉलेज. माय सिंसियर थैंक्स टू अवर डिस्टिंग्विश्ड स्पीकर डॉक्टर हिमेंद्र भारती, who touched even the minutest detail concerning the topic, beautifully correlating it with the current universal situation. My gratitude towards our principal sir, Dr. S.K. Arora ji, and our torchbearer HOD, Professor Puneet Puri. Thanks to all the faculty members of the department in extending their wholehearted cooperation, and of course the non-teaching staff in making this program a success. My regards to all the dear students and esteemed participants who joined the event, sparing their valuable time. Looking forward to meeting offline, sir. In the future, we would definitely have you presence in the college. My thanks to one and all, and my message to all of you is stay home, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
We'll soon be sharing the feedback link for your certificates because some of them are eagerly waiting for that. I will just be sharing there in the chat box. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm just sharing the feedback. Just wait for it.
Okay, sir.
The feedback link is also sent in the WhatsApp group. I'd shared it. You can have your certificate from here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.